Hello, and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rowe.
Andy, we are in the throes of summer right now, which means that you've been out on some adventures yourself, and we are also planning a con, and it seems like we're a month into summer, and I feel like it just started yesterday.
Yes, I know. I realized today, looking at some work deadlines, that July is like right around the corner, and it does seem like it should only be mid-May right now.
Yes, right, yeah, whether you like it or not, it's coming. So as I mentioned, the con, we have the Roll for Topic con is going to happen again out in Ann Arbor. We're pretty excited for that. We actually just nailed down the schedule and stuff. I'm excited. Please reach out if you are in town and you're planning on coming. Let us know. We can get you information if you need it. So you had mentioned to me before we got on that you had a topic that you wanted to discuss. I don't know. You want to reveal reveal what you're thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. But before we jump in, so summer is traditionally is when you catch up on your beach reads and things like that. So before we jump into the topic I have in mind, have you been reading anything or watching anything that's kind of RPG adjacent or that's gotten your GMing wheels spinning?
Yeah, of course. I guess I could only read beach reads. Beach reads with my beach body. So I'm continuing to read, I think I mentioned this a few episodes ago, the Dungeon Crawler Carl series.
Yeah.
So I'm on the fourth book of that. Yeah, so it's by Matt Dinniman. He is not like a New York Times #1 best-selling author, but he's really good, and I'm really enjoying these books quite a bit. So they're a little bit silly. They're from the, I just forgot it, the RPG lit genre.
Lit RPG.
Sorry, lit RPG. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and they're just like a fantastic amount of fun. And of course that gets my GM brain going because they're basically set up like he's going through a mega dungeon. This most recent one that I'm on, it's the fourth book. I think it's called The Gate of the Feral Gods, which is a rad title. The whole conceit of it is that he's sort of like locked in this small part of the dungeon with a bunch of other people that are going through the dungeon that are much lower level than him. So he has to sort of rally the troops, figure out how to get these underleveled other players up to his level and all that, and then take them through this whole story. But yeah, it's super fun, and it just makes me think about like how to design a dungeon in a way that is just like somewhat of a playground for your players to show off and to just sort of experience like the zany parts of it. Because the books are written such you can tell that the characters are having a lot of fun and stuff like that, and it's very fun to read. So that's been good. I know I will never convince you to read those books, but maybe I'm convincing someone who's listening to the podcast.
If you bring one, if you have a physical copy or something to TCon, I will take a look and
and pass judgment.
Yeah, well, I just need to evaluate the pun to non-pun ratio, and that will determine it. So.
Yeah, it's pretty high, so or pretty low. I don't know, whatever, 1 to 1. Yeah. And then the other thing is we just started watching the show Severance. Have you heard of this or seen this?
I have heard of it.
Yeah, it is a pretty cerebral sci-fi show that has a number of horror elements to it, I would say, too. Without giving like too much away, the whole idea behind it is that there's this procedure called severance that you can go through, which separates your working life from your home life. So it's like the ultimate in work-life balance, such that you do not remember, your brain is split, right? So whenever you go to work, you're just at work, right? Like you have a whole separate personality, a whole separate set of memories and stuff at work. And then when you leave work, you have like the rest of your life. And so the way that they sort of signify that is as you're going down an elevator, there's like a moment at which you switch over. The scary part, and this is like the minorest of spoilers, right? It comes up pretty quickly in the season, but I guess jump forward 30 seconds if you don't want to hear about anything about Severance, is the working self never feels like they've left and they can never experience sleep. They go into an elevator, right? And they start going up, and then they switch over to their their home life.
Yeah.
But then when they come back into consciousness, they're coming back down the elevator. No time has passed for them. And it is just like a chilling idea.
That feels very relevant to the world we're all soaking in right now.
Yes. Oh, extremely. Yeah. But anyway, so that has my GM brain going in all sorts of directions, right? Because there's an element of running games where you're sort of constantly trying to figure out stories and trying to like kind of crack them a bit and like think about how you might tell them. So obviously if you have this setup in Severance, it's like you can think about 100 million different ways this could go.
Yeah.
So it's just like such a strong concept. And like once you have heard about it, like it's just one of those sci-fi concepts that sort of just sticks in your craw and you're like, oh, that's that's awesome, right? Like I want to use that in one of my games, or come up with something along those lines too that I think like your players can really grab onto and be like, this is the logic of the world that sort of guides all my decisions.
Have you ever run an RPG, or have you thought of running an RPG that has a kind of a sci-fi gimmick like that? That
Hmm.
involves maybe hiding from the players what's really going on until they can kind of piece together the situation. I'm trying to imagine
Yeah.
like in an RPG, well, think of the Matrix or just anything else where a protagonist is kept in the dark about certain things, and it just feels like kind of a sci-fi
Hmm.
thing to do. And then at some point in the course of the story, they figure it out, or they put the pieces together to figure out what's missing. There's so many great science fiction stories and movies that have some element of that.
Hmm.
The vast majority of sci-fi RPGs seem to sort of eschew cleverness like that, and I don't
Yes.
mean that in the sneery way that it sounded.
Yeah,
they,
that did
they
sound
they
pretty
seem
mean.
to avoid going for those high concept gimmicks, and instead they stick with the more just action movie or
Hmm.
sci-fi movie type default. Have you ever
Yeah.
thought about doing something like that, and would you run that, or does that just seem like it's not a good fit?
I think it'd be hard to pull off. You'd want to have some parameters around like sort of what's secret and what's not, both in game and out. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on that. Like most sci-fi games that I can think of, right? Like the sci-fi part is like, oh, you have phasers instead of swords or whatever, right? It's
Yeah,
like, yeah, it's like that's the limit of the technology. But I mean, you think about something like Star Trek, and I've never played that RPG, but I mean, having access to faster than light travel, or like being able to transport, right? Like the beam me up, Scotty, that style of stuff, like that could really change how you interact with like action sequences, or like, yeah,
yeah.
or just, yeah, things of those natures. But yeah, going back to your question about running that, yeah, I think it'd be hard for me to pull off because I don't have a very good poker face, and I think you sort of need to have that to piece those things together. It's that like drip feed of information throughout the campaign, right? Like, I don't know, yeah, there's some sort of evil megacorp that's behind everything. How do you like subtly make hints towards that so people can piece it together? I think that'd be pretty hard to do, but I think it would be really fun. I think it's not something that me as a GM I don't think I could pull off.
Yeah, you see this a lot in Star Trek episodes, especially 90s,
Hmm.
like 80s and 90s Star Trek. For like the last decade, I've been trying to make my way through Star Trek Voyager,
Okay.
which when I get to the end of that, we'll have to chat about it. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's really common, or that a typical episode's premise will turn out like, oh, they were in the holodeck the whole time, or
Hmm.
oh, this is like some kind of a dream sequence, or oh, they're actually clones of the real crew. And you can do this in a show and it works, but
Hmm.
it's hard to imagine. And I thought about this when I ran my Star Trek adventures recently. I was trying to think, what's a very Star Trekky adventure to have? And lots of Star Trek episodes have one of these gimmicks. But in a RPG, how do you pull that off? Like, how do
Hmm.
you say at the end, no, you're actually in the holodeck?
Yeah, there's something that'd be very deflating about that. I think if it took, like a Star Trek episode is what, 45 minutes or so. If you
Right.
cut the commercials out of it, I think that's a good amount of time for the big reveal to be like, oh, actually, like this other thing was going on. I think if I got to the end of even a 3 hour session and that was the big the big reveal, it'd be like, well, okay,
Yeah.
like thanks for all that. Unless there's some sort of like, yeah, really really nice direct tie, like maybe like the big bad was also in there with you, or like he was controlling the holodeck
Yeah.
at the same time, right? And that's why, I don't know, yeah, you were pirates on
Yeah.
yeah, out in the middle of the sea.
It's interesting food for thought. In thinking if I want to run something at RFTCon, the
Mhm.
con theme is secrets.
Yes.
So one of the type of secrets you can have is to hide something from your players about
Hmm.
what the game's experience is going to involve. So
Yes.
I've been thinking through, like, is it fun or is it irritating if, like, what if halfway through the game session we switch to a different game and I grab
Mm.
your character sheet and I hand you something else? Is that fun, or is that not really? Am I trying to achieve an effect in an RPG that really is better suited for other mediums?
Yeah, so like the change into a different game, new character sheet. I mean, I think that's really fascinating. If you can pull that off such that it makes sense, I think that sort of reveal would be I would be delighted at the table if that happened. Right?
Okay, well,
Yeah.
no, everyone listening, pretend you
Yes.
didn't hear that. Then,
Yeah. Yeah. The if you've read have you read Pattern Recognition by William
yes,
Gibson?
I really enjoyed that book.
Yeah, I think about that book quite a bit, but I feel like
Yes,
that's a good example of, I mean, very near future sci-fi, or like, present day sci-fi almost, when it was written, right? Like now everything in it is antiquated, but like that book is just so good at that slow drip feed of information,
yeah,
right? Like the main character, she just like keeps on discovering like little bits of information that piece together all this, right? And that's
yeah.
the whole point of her character, really, is that she's good at that sort of thing. But I mean, like, yeah, if you want a master class in how you build up like a grand mystery, and watch as it's being solved sort of real time, like that book is 100% worth reading.
Yeah, or to keep on the Gibson theme, The Peripheral, which
Yeah.
I'm currently watching the show. I really enjoyed that novel.
Hmm.
How would you pitch The Peripheral as a role playing game? And I
Hmm.
won't spoil the details of the twist, but there's kind of a twist that radically changes your understanding of what's going on, like
Hmm.
partway through the book. Do you pitch that as the pre-twist plot line, or does your pitch contain that twist as part of its pitch? And so you go in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, because with if you have that information, like a reread of a lot of Gibson novels, like you just have so much more information. Like, yeah, and I don't know how you would sustain interest in the game if there was sort of like hidden knowledge of the world that you didn't quite know yet.
Yeah. Or think the
Um,
Matrix, right? What
yeah.
is the Matrix? Do you pitch that like, do you do a couple sessions of like Neo being a programmer,
Hmm.
having real world adventures, and
Yeah.
then you unveil that you're actually running this martial arts, sci-fi
Yeah.
gobbledygook, awesome, movie or show? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think like in all things, it's sort of, player buy-in, right? So if you have players that sort of want to experience that and like want to go through that experience, I think it's great. I do think you need to not leave the reveal for too long.
yeah,
And then the campaign cannot hinge only on the reveal, right? Like there's got to be something interesting,
yeah.
interesting after it, which is a problem because, like, I mean, those the hooks are really fun to think about. It's the like, how do you make it cohesive and enjoyable through to the end? That's the hard part. Yeah.
When I was younger, running Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition, Ravenloft came out, and
Mm.
Ravenloft was kind of TSR's. Well, you know about Ravenloft.
Hmm.
It had Strahd in it, and I don't know the timing. I suspect it was an attempt to cash in on like vampire and
Yeah.
other horror theme stuff. But the premise of that was you can occasionally pull your characters from their normal campaign into the mists of Ravenloft and have
Hmm.
a horror adventure, and then probably drop them back into wherever they're normally adventuring. And so that's what I did on a number of different occasions, and it always felt a little bit like a risk I was taking,
Hmm.
because if you show up and you're ready to like spend the next couple sessions pursuing your quest in the world of Kryn or Greyhawk or whatever,
Hmm.
and then you get pulled into like, oh, actually we're doing a surprise Halloween thing for the next couple of sessions.
Yeah.
Maybe that's awesome, or maybe you're like, this isn't what I signed up for.
Yeah.
It feels like getting a good fun surprise is worth the risk, but the risk is that somebody won't enjoy the surprise, right?
Hmm.
So anyway, we don't need to beat this topic to death, but
Yeah.
I think maybe we could circle back and talk about this as a topic on a future episode.
Yeah. No, I think this is all really good stuff to talk about. Like you mentioned, right? The con that we have coming up, the theme is secrets. So we're all sort of thinking about those those sorts of things. So I think this is like all good food for thought.
In a situation like with a con game or a close group of friends, I mean,
Mm.
there's situations where you could say, hey guys, I have kind of a fun idea for this
Yes.
game, and I need you to bear with me.
Hmm.
And I think I that's how I would do it if I were going
Hmm.
to try to run a Matrix style switcheroo game.
Yeah. And I think, most people, again, like, will sort of rise to the occasion when you do that. Like
Yeah,
I've certainly asked players before to like just go with me, like, right, like I'm going to set up some ground rules and then we're going to say go, and now we're in the game. and like when we're in the game, I need you to like kind of participate in this in a certain way for this to work.
Yeah.
And that can work really well. It can also feel a little bit like everybody's sort of acting, but I think that's okay too, right? Like
Yeah.
that's fine. Yeah, you don't need to, like, not everybody has to be like so fully committed that there's disbelief is suspended completely and utterly at every moment at your game table.
Well, the other thing I wanted to touch on briefly before I move on to our real topic was, so the big kind of RPG adjacent thing I've been reading lately is I finally made it through the first two books of Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun.
Okay.
So Shadow of the Torturer and Claw of the Conciliator.
Okay.
And I tried in a book group that I think you were a member of. I
Hmm.
tried reading the first book of this many years ago, kind of bounced off some unpleasant setting elements
Hmm.
that left a bad taste in my mouth. But so many, it's just one of these books that so many people I respect are like, it's worth it, it's worth it, it's worth it, that I revisit it.
Yeah, just real quick, I'm googling Shadow of the Torturer, and I think I read this, and I think about this book quite a bit. Yeah, so you follow
Yes.
Severin, the torturer. Yes,
Yes.
yeah, it was very good, but yes, it was unpleasant.
Yeah, and let's bookmark this to unpack more later. But
Hmm.
a while ago, I was on our sister podcast, if we're calling it that, the Splat
Hmm.
Book, talking about Stephen King's The Gunslinger.
Yeah.
And after the recording, we were talking about like some of the gross parts of that book that we did not discuss
Hmm.
on the podcast because they're gross
Yeah.
and no one wants to talk about them. But Kyle Latino or someone was saying, the challenge with those things are like, sometimes those create the friction with like a work of art that actually makes it memorable to you.
Hmm.
And that I've thought about that a lot as I read Gene Wolfe, because I find a lot of elements of the story, I find the main character kind of gross, and I find elements of the setting is kind of a cruel, ugly one. But at the same time, it's very compelling, and I don't think a version of this story that polished those away would be as compelling. So
Yeah.
there is a tension there, or a friction that makes it work. You wind up with a work of art that it's maybe hard to recommend to someone, although it
Hmm.
was worthwhile for you to experience it. And that I think about. I've been thinking about that stupid book since I finished it.
Yeah, there. That is right on. Kurt Vonnegut has a book, Galapagos. I think it's not necessarily one of his strongest novels, although like all of Vonnegut novels, like there's lots of stuff in it. They're just like, oh, that is a really brilliant observation on humanity.
Yes. Yes.
But like, yeah, there's a point at which like there's something that's like kind of gross that happens in it, but I think Vonnegut actually like kind of breaks the fourth wall and sort of says like, this is why none of my books ever get made into movies,
Oh,
right? Is because
interesting.
there's always like this element of it that's like, it's gross, it sort of works on the page, but if you tried to visualize it, like it would just be distasteful enough that you wouldn't want to watch it, right? And like, but you also
Yeah.
sort of need to have it described for the story to work,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and like that's absolutely true. It's like, well, now I don't know, like, how do I recommend this book to someone? It's like you almost need to be like, look, I know that this was not great, you are also going to think that's not great. I don't want you to have that be a reflection upon like my morality that
Right.
I'm recommending
Exactly.
this to you, right? It's like the same reason like there's probably certain movies you just never recommended to your parents, even though might enjoy them. They need to get that recommendation from someone else, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe you have a different relationship to your parents than I do, but like, yeah, that's yeah, there's absolutely something to that.
Awesome. Well, hey, let's. I think we now have another podcast where we talk about video games all the time, and
Hmm.
we're just going to have one where we talk about the fantasy books that we're reading.
Yes, yeah.
So, but let's move
For sure.
back to our actual podcast, gaming topics. And
Hmm.
so, Chris, I have a topic to lob in your general direction. I
Hmm.
just got back from a road trip to and back from Tennessee,
Hmm.
so stayed in a lot of cool places, saw a lot of cool history stuff, especially Civil War battlefields and stuff while I was
Yeah.
down there. Super neat. And of course, because my GM brain is always running, I emerged from that trip with the sense that in the fantasy D&D-ish games I run, none of the towns or villages that the PCs stop through feel very interesting or like they have anything definingly cool about them. And I'm not
Okay.
talking about like the big capital cities, which will, by the nature of what they are, will have
Hmm.
lots of cool stuff in them. As we're driving through, and we took kind of a off the interstate, more rural drive through these states. And
Hmm.
as you know, as you travel, I mean, everywhere you go, every town seems to have like a thing. So it's like, this is the birthplace of so and so, or
Hmm.
we have like a tiny one room museum dedicated to this very specific piece of history that's relevant to our town.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's the thing like, so we stayed with a number of friends in these different towns, and so they would always be like, oh, while you're here, the one thing you've got to do or
Yeah.
see or eat is
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if maybe we could talk about, in a D&D type environment, besides a few of the really obvious things, like there's a statue of a hero in the town
Mm-hmm.
square, what are like half a dozen things that are more interesting than that statue in the town square
Mm-hmm.
that could just liven up that town that exists only to have an inn where you can like restock supplies?
That's a super good question. Before we get into that, though, what's the smallest town you've ever lived in?
Oh, I ever lived in? I've
Yeah.
never lived in a really small town, so I
Okay.
guess like Muskegon, Michigan was
Okay.
probably the
Yeah.
smallest.
Yeah, probably.
That's,
And
but I
that's
don't think that I wouldn't call it a small town.
no, yeah, no, I would say yeah, it's like a decent sized town. So I lived in a small town in Indiana for a little bit, Alexandria, Indiana. The way I like to describe Alexandria is when you get off the highway to turn into Alexandria, there's a bunch of signs that say, like, food, gas, all that sort of stuff. They're all pointing in the opposite direction from Alexandria. So you get off the highway and it's like, well, it's that way, but if you need anything else, go the other way. But it's the sort of city that is absolutely like that. It's like you have two diners, right? There's the one downtown and the one on the outskirts of town. There's like one famous person who's from there who has like a mega compound in the middle of the city, right? And then other than that, it's a very like knowable city. You have a handful of buildings, right? There's the grocery store that is since closed, so you got to drive 20 minutes to go to the Meijer, right? Like, all those sorts of details about it that like are common in other towns. But I mean, I think the thing that I keep on thinking about with small towns and the ones around there in Indiana that I kind of visited, yeah, you're right. They all have that one thing. There's usually some sort of like somewhat disgraced famous person, or like, someone who's like, well, I guess they're famous enough for them to be our famous person. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there's just like your first hook, right? Like, so there is, some sort of like rich person, famous person that like did not quite make it. Yeah. Another town that I was in that I worked at the public library down in Indiana, Elwood, Indiana, that place, there was a failed like Republican presidential candidate from down there, like, right, like
Okay, yeah,
didn't even make the like
right,
wasn't even like the person, or he might have been like the GOP candidate or something
right, right.
like that, but like the town is very proud of that, although like by all accounts, so what, right? Like you didn't win, but like it was important for them. But I mean, that leads to lots of interesting things, like people who like can claim genealogy, right? Like with this person, you have that one room museum, stuff like that. But in a D&D setting, I think you could do that exact thing, but then there's also like some treasure that they have that's part of their, right, like just like that hook to be like, oh, I remember that town because this is the town where the guy who ran for mayor of Neverwinter, didn't make it, was from.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a good one. So what marks this famous person in the
Mm-hmm.
town? A middling wizard who
Mm-hmm.
served for like one of the lesser kings was born here, right?
Yeah.
So what do you have in the town that the PCs would encounter about that, besides
Mm-hmm.
just hearing, oh, that wizard was born here?
Yeah. I mean, I think you could have like a street named after them, or like maybe the town square is named after them too. An area.
Maybe his childhood, like
Yeah.
home. Sometimes you go to these towns in the little towns in the plain states or Midwest, and like a little hut or something, from the 1800s will have been carefully restored. What if there's this shelves of like his old letters and journals, and he
Ooh.
doesn't really realize that they're all still there, and maybe in those letters is like
Yes.
interesting redeeming information. Anyway,
Yeah, well, that's a good hook. Yeah, like, oh, they preserved it. I didn't realize that they used that sort of magic that
right,
preserved everything that I've ever thought written down.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that. Like, you could have like a library, named after them, right, along those same lines too.
Oh, yep.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a kind of a themed library. Like maybe he donated money, and this weird little town has an oddly extensive collection of magic books centered around a very specific type of magic or something like that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because I think like, yeah, you could easily send your players on like a bit of a wild goose chase, trying to find like, yeah, one specific spell, or like, yeah, one specific piece of information. So the other thing I'm thinking, right, like just, yeah, like to change the subject a little bit is like,
Yeah.
I think, and you touched on it, right, like the world's largest whatever. right? So a
Yep.
lot of these towns will have like, I mean, I think there was a town again, sort of nearby where I was living down there that had like the world's largest like ball of paint, right? Like so, like like stuff like that, or the world's largest ball of twine,
Yeah.
something like that. Like I'm a bit jokey, so I would probably make it like the world's like second largest ball of twine,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because like someone, some other city, took
Well,
the
like the
yeah.
right group of players, in the same way that players will sometimes go crazy with like dumb little comic
Hmm.
NPCs that you throw in, the right group of players could have a lot of fun with a town that has the second largest ball of paint, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Like, I mean, I think I immediately went to like, well, let's make it the number one largest, right? Like, how are they gonna are they gonna do that? Kind of restore the town's reputation. But yeah, I mean, I think there's like all sorts of things you can do. Like, I don't know, maybe like the world's like largest like coil of rope, right? Like your 50-foot rope section, they have one that's 5,000 feet long. Yeah.
One obvious thing is there's like a cool natural feature there. But
Hmm.
in a fantasy setting where you're teleporting around and raising the dead, it's harder to evoke the kind of goofy wonder sometimes that a
Yeah.
bizarre natural formation or a bizarre piece of art
Hmm.
would evoke. But I think if you have players who could get into it, that'd be really fun. It
Hmm.
does make me think. You mentioning the second biggest whatever does make me think that like rivalries could be a fun thing, like
Hmm.
just a dumb local rivalry with the other town says that they have the oldest whatever,
Yeah.
the oldest loaf of bread, and you say that your town has it, and you both have a shrine to your
Yes.
ancient loaf of bread or something like that.
When people are proud of stuff, like proud of things about their town, like I think that's a very real sense, right? Like it doesn't matter like how big city you are, and you're like looking down on them. Like, why do you care that you have the largest ball of twine? You're like, yeah, this famous person was from there. It's like, well, because we do, like we all kind of sort of like collectively care about. So I think as much as you can kind of build that into your fantasy towns is the better, right? Like it's not just something that you can brush off that all these people really care about them having the oldest loaf of bread. Like this is a very real like concrete,
Right, right.
yeah, concrete thing. And it's like it's sort of up to the players to either ignore that hook entirely or to get also invested in it. And I think they're probably most of the time going to get invested in something
Yeah.
that out there and silly.
There are ways you could tie something like this into a plot, like find the wizard's childhood home and poke through his diary to find
Yeah.
his hidden secret. But for the most part, this is stuff meant to kind of add flavor.
Hmm.
So some other things just to kind of to keep moving along. So food is obviously a huge one.
Hmm.
In each place we stayed, where we stayed with friends, their thing that we had to do in the town was you've got to try this. The catfish here is
Oh,
fantastic. So
yeah.
it reminds me of our episode a couple episodes ago with Jeremy By, where he described a time when we were talking about using food in RPGs, and he talked about having his players come to this inn and they had the option to buy this more expensive, fancy version of the food. And all of them were like, well, of course we have to buy
Yes.
the elaborately named, more expensive, no mechanical difference whatsoever
Hmm.
version of this food. I've been in towns where people really take the food seriously. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
Like we make this kind of pastry here. It's our thing. And every meal, it's like you're having one or someone's trying to push one on you.
Yeah, totally. That like yeah, the local delicacy or just like the one restaurant, right, that everybody everybody goes to. You do a lot with that. I'm trying really hard not to just strip mine my memory for everything from Alexandria and mentioning it here, but
It sounds delightful, actually.
it's like yeah. I mean, I think when you have so few things to choose from, like everything sort of starts to fixate in your mind a bit.
Yeah, totally, totally.
The other, have you heard of mudlarking before?
No, I don't think
Okay,
so.
so mudlarking is this like hobby, pastime, whatever you want to call it, where people will go to rivers and sort of dig around and see sort of what they can find inside of them. So there's a lot of people that do this out in London on the Thames, right? Like because you just have all this history of like people who've thrown all their their garbage essentially into
Right.
the river over like hundreds, if not thousands of years and stuff. So you can find stuff that was garbage to them, but like is sort of a neat curiosity. Yeah, like a town like on the outskirts of Neverwinter, whatever, right? Like some sort of like stream downwind from another place. Like maybe the entire thing about the town is like picking picking garbage out of the river to
Huh.
resell or something like that. Yeah, or it's like they are the garbage heap for Neverwinter. There's lots of ways that the party could confront that, right? Like maybe it's just like, oh, that's weird, or maybe there's ways they could exfiltrate stuff out of the city by tossing it into the river and then going to pick it up like later, or going to the city to like stop them from polluting everything downriver.
So here's a different one. When I was younger, my mom wrote a novel set in a smallish town in Northern California,
Hmm.
and we basically spent several summers worth of family vacations going up there so mom could use the local library and
Mm,
archives to read
yeah.
up. And she was looking for like just all sorts of detail, going through records basically to so that she could present the town accurately. And what if the idea of a town that keeps exhaustive records about something or
Hmm.
about itself, I think could have some potential to be interesting. Like, what if every visitor to a town who comes through the town gate has to write down where they came from, what their
Yes.
business is, and where they're going next?
Oh wow.
And
Yeah.
so, what if you have like 200 years in sitting in the town courthouse? What if there's 200 years of a list of every person that came through? I mean, you could structure a whole plot around trying to find what happened to whatever, an expedition that vanished
Hmm.
100 years ago. You could try to reconstruct a path by digging through the documentary record that they left.
Yes, totally. And Andy, why is this line blank? I don't understand.
Right, yeah, and you can
Yeah.
you can throw great intriguing little mysteries in there as well.
Yeah, and that's totally the sort of thing, right? Like you have some eccentric person who's like going to take that on and then becomes the city's identity.
Totally. And so something else, and again, just to keep rolling here because I we should wrap up soon. I mean, so the other thing you see all the time is this is the place where blank happened, or like variants of it, this is where like blank event began or where blank event like ended. So, when I go to Nebraska to visit my in-laws, you can go to towns there that are like this tiny little thing was where the westward expansion started, and
Hmm.
you could use that kind of thing without info dumping stuff on your players. You could just build out your setting a little bit. It doesn't have to relate to what the players are doing, but and maybe even especially if you ask them, like you invite them to help you flesh out what happened. I mean, battles are the big thing, but maybe it's more interesting when it's not just this is where a fight happened, but this is where some sort of setting shaping thing touched this place in a way that it didn't touch other places.
Hmm.
And how did that affect the way that this settlement grew or shrank, or how does it affect the attitude that the locals have towards the rest of the setting?
Yeah, this is the spot where the Great Fire started, right? And it's like
Right.
and went westward from here. It's like, yeah, I mean, you could have that be
And to this day, they are insistent that they didn't start it. That
yes, yeah,
you know,
even though you look west and all the trees are burned, but you look east and like
right, right.
But I mean, yeah, you're right on. There's all sorts of ways to use that. Yeah, because I mean, like right, like you think about it, like you're playing these games and like you're naturally traveling from place to place, right? Like, and I think yeah, it is a shame to just leave that as like a okay, you stop in this little podunk and spend the night and then get on to the next place. Sometimes you need that for pacing, whatever. But like I think there's lots of opportunities in there.
Why is this worth doing? Why is it worth looking for little opportunities to flesh out these places? I mean, one obvious reason is just if you've ever looked through like kind of a more old school RPG setting, there'll be like even new ones, I guess. I have books in my basement, RPG books, setting books that have like 100 pages of history
Hmm.
that the GM is going to read maybe, but that the players are not unless they're really obsessed with the setting, right?
Yeah.
The creator is attempting to add immense depth to a setting for
Hmm.
to achieve some purpose of immersion or believability or just heft. No one wants to hand the players like, please read these 50 pages of history that all happened before you came on the scene and doesn't really affect you. No one wants to do that. I've played a few video games where like museums are in the game. So I think one or more of the Ultimas let you go into museums that let you look at artifacts from past games
Hmm.
in the series. I have a feeling there's some like clever ways to suggest depth of a setting that
Hmm.
aren't just info dumps that could be achieved through this little micro experiences where
Hmm.
you encounter a piece of the setting's history, piece of the setting that you are not going to bump into in the course of like the mission that you're on.
Yes.
Engage with it for a minute, maybe play with it if your players want to, or just move on. Especially, I think if you're involving your players maybe and fleshing some of this out, you could turn a fairly rote journey across the continent into something that significantly adds to like the experience of the setting. So there's
Hmm.
my little monologue.
Yes. No, that's a good monologue. And I'm going to tell you yet again, without spoilers, that I think you'd like Severance quite a bit.
Okay,
Based
okay,
on that.
good.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah. All
so
right.
this has been Roll for Topic,
Yeah.
the Severance podcast, and
Sorry, that's what the podcast is, just whatever my current current obsession is. Yeah.
whatever I looked at last before sitting down to record is basically what this podcast ends up
Yeah.
being about.
Sounds good.
Okay,
All
well,
right.
shall we wrap things up?
Yeah.
Did you have any final statements along the lines of how to interesting up your little towns in the middle of nowhere?
The only thing I would say is try to visit more small towns, and like especially if you see that they're doing a street festival or
Oh,
like something like
yes.
that. Yeah, go to all those small town festivals and like try to. I mean, I think the majority of people who are listening to this are not sarcastic hipsters anymore, right? So like go with an open mind and enjoy those things rather than just going to be kind of like, oh, this is so dumb. Like, what are they doing? Right? Like, yeah. I mean, I think I definitely did that in college. I apologize to anybody who knew me back then. But yeah, it's like nowadays, like that sort of stuff is great. Yeah. But I mean, I think that's where you get all the good ideas for like, oh, this is sort of like how like weird and specific people get and how wonderful it is that they do that and how to bring that into your games.
Is the biggest ball of paint, which I have to say is magnificent, by the
Yeah.
way. Like I pray that's real and that you didn't make that up.
Yeah.
But like, do you have one more juicy tidbit from super small town Indiana to share? Tell us one other glory that awaits us in rural Indiana.
Okay, yes. Well, so the world's largest ball of paint is in Alexandria, Indiana. You can go see it. I just looked it up. Michael Carmichael is the guy that has made it, mostly using latex paint.
And
Just
by the
kind
way,
of,
you just know that there is like this insanely complex web of lawsuits and threats,
oh
and
yeah.
like that half of the family like split off and claims they have the true ball of paint. Like
Yes.
you just know there's an amazing drama behind this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave you with the last note about Alexandria, Indiana. I don't know if it's still there, but the one cafe in town was let's say it was operated by someone who was hyper religious. So like you'd walk in and there were like crosses and religious paraphernalia up absolutely everywhere. It was the sort of place you walk in and you're like, I understand who runs this place. Exactly. And a not terrible cup of coffee. So there you go.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. All right, let's wrap up then. You want to sign us off here?
Yeah. Well, this has been Roll for Topic. We thank you so much for listening. Our sister show, The Splat Book, continues. They are amazing. Kyle Latino and John Corey. I almost said Kyle Corey and John Latino.
Yeah,
They're
they're
sort of
blurring
merging
into
into
one
one hive
entity.
mind. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can go listen to their podcast at thesplatbook.com. It is really wonderful. I have not listened to the latest episode, but I know that Kyle has a sort of a new thing that he is fixated on, which is I think it's like play away from the table is his acronym PAWFFT.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to pronounce like what the acronym would be in real life, but yeah, go listen to that. Kyle also has a new game out as well, which you can find on his Etsy store as well at Macro.
Yeah, while we were on the road, I caught up on my splat book listening. You know, there is maybe like 4 splat books in a row is like the maximum the human
Okay.
mind can
Yes.
handle. But
Yeah.
but I pushed those limits, and it was actually very delightful.
Yes, yeah, they're wonderful. I mean, they just think very deeply about these things, and I appreciate both of them so much. But yeah, so go listen to them. Yeah, we are part of the Roll for It Media podcasting network as well as they are too. Like I mentioned earlier, if you are in Ann Arbor and you sort of you know us personally, let us know if you want to come to the con and we can try to figure that out with you. That would be wonderful. It's happening later in August. But yeah, I think that does it for us. So I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rowe.
And remember, if your player is having fun, you're a great GM.